Good morning. I am often asked the question, what was the cause of the American Civil War? And this is a natural question for students to ask, but I must say that it's very, very complicated. And so I think the best way to look at the causes of the American Civil War is to break it down into categories. Long-term causes of the American Civil War, short-term causes of the American Civil War, and finally, triggers. Now, what are the long-term causes of the American Civil War? One of the critical issues is in regard to power. Okay? If you go back to the formation of the American Republic, what you will find is this issue of power emerges within those debates and continues well throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, actually. What is the proper role of government? Is it the federal government that has the right to tax? Or is that relegated to the individual states? Is it the federal government that has the right to determine whether slavery is legal or not? Or is that something that should be determined by the individual states? And so throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, you are going to see this struggle between the state and the federal government. And this is going to undergird the struggle for power, is going to undergird many of the long-term causes of the American Civil War. Another of the long-term causes, or second long-term cause, is without a doubt slavery. I mean, for sure, this is one of the long-term causes. If you look at the debates, or you look at the debates during the formation of the Republic, the founders attempted to avoid using the word. But nonetheless, slavery is one of the long-term causes. And I think that when we look at slavery, it's really helpful to think along these lines. Think of how the problem of slavery manifests itself in the 19th century. Okay? In other words, slavery, the issue of slavery will be manifested in the political arena. It will come up as a political problem. Slavery will become a social problem. It will become an intellectual problem or an intellectual issue. And it's going to become a moral issue or a moral problem as well. So I really think that it's very helpful to look at slavery and look at the ways that it manifests itself. Okay, for example, it manifests itself as a political problem during the debates over the territories. Now think of those states. Think of those states in the middle portion of the 19th century that are attempting to move from the position of a territory to a state. And what was the discussion over? Right? I mean, slavery manifests itself there. Will those territories that are becoming states, will they ultimately enter the Union as a free state or a slave state? So slavery will manifest itself as a political problem, but it will ultimately manifest itself increasingly as a moral issue. Okay, so it's very, very helpful, I think, to when you're studying your text, when you're reading your text, to just look at the ways in which slavery manifests itself in these arenas of political, social, moral, and intellectual spheres. Another of the long-term causes is the problem of sections, North versus South. The North, as you have at this point know from your readings, was far more modern. It was far more industrial. And the South was far more agricultural. However, I've got to include something of a caveat here. You need to understand that while the South was far more agricultural, it was by no means backwards. If you take, in 1860, if you take the states that ultimately formed the Southern Confederacy, and you take them as a single entity and compare them to the other industrialized countries of the world, what you would find in terms of gross domestic product or gross national product, what you would find is that the South ranked fourth overall. But nonetheless, the South was far more agricultural than the North. It was far more community focused. It was far more personal. And so clearly, one of the long-term causes of the American Civil War is this rivalry that develops between the two sections. And it's also intensified by how the two sections view one another. And I think this is also a long-term cause of the American Civil War. Perceptions, how the two viewed one another, how events are recorded, how events are transmitted. Okay, for example, Charles Sumner, his speech over Kansas. Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts, as you no doubt know at this point, delivered a highly inflammatory speech from inside the halls of Congress. And it was so laced with sexual metaphors, and the speech was entitled "The Rape of Kansas." In this speech, he attacks a senator from South Carolina. Ultimately, what will happen is the senators from South Carolina's nephew, Preston Brooks, will step forward to defend the honor of his uncle, and Brooks will beat Charles Sumner senseless. The fact of the matter is, Sumner will be hurt. He will be out of the. He will not sit in his seat for the next 2 years after the beating. Brooks will be forced to resign, but he will ultimately he will resign from the House, but he'll ultimately be reelected. Nonetheless, the reason that I mention this is the way that this event was perceived. In the North, they saw the beating of Charles Sumner as being a perfect example of the barbarians that lived in the South. Okay, but in the South, the view was entirely different. Okay, their perception of this event was along the lines of touche. I mean, for example, Brooks resigns. Okay, he resigns, but he'll be reelected. And I guess a great point would just be people will send, Southerners will send hundreds of canes to Preston Brooks. That, in other words, that's their way of saying attaboy. Nonetheless, throughout the 1850s, these perceptions of how the sections view one another will increasingly become volatile, and they will become increasingly more and more hostile as they launch accusations at one another. Now, the short-term causes. The short-term causes are pretty easy. They are those events that precede the war. I mean, look at the decade of the 1850s. It seemed to be marching along at a pace, moving towards an ultimate outbreak of conflict between North and South. That compromise of 1850, which all it does is delay the outbreak of conflict. It delays it. It puts it on delay for 10 years. 1852, the publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And as people read this work, many of them came to realize that these people that were enslaved in the South were in fact humans. And so it becomes a wake-up call for many. Bleeding Kansas, the fighting in Kansas between the anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces. The caning of Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks, which ultimately became a symbol of the division, of the divide between the North and the South. The formation of the Republican Party, a party that is formed as the anti-slavery party. Increasingly, the increasing publicity in the latter portion of the 1850s of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. 1857, the Dred Scott decision. 1859, John Brown's raid. In the 1850s, we begin to see a lot more violence, a lot more bloodshed. The language becomes far more inflammatory and confrontational. So, what we have are these long-term causes. These long-term causes, the central, what is the role, what is the proper role of government, the rivalry between the sections, the perceptions, and they are wrapped up in these short-term causes, these events that are marching along in the decade of the 1850s. Now, the last of these categories are the triggers. The triggers are those events that immediately precipitate the outbreak of the American Civil War. One of these triggers will undoubtedly be the election of 1860. During the campaign season of 1860, during the nominating process of 1860, the Democrats will meet first. They will come together in Charleston, South Carolina, the hotbed of inflammatory rhetoric. And immediately there's going to be conflict within the Democratic Party. And it's going to be over the issue of slavery. What the pro-slavery faction desired was that the Democratic Party would create a platform that included within the platform a federal guarantee, a call for a federal guarantee of the right to own slaves. Now, Northern Democrats are not going to go along with this, and so there's going to be conflict. There's going to be conflict within the Democratic Party at the convention. And a number of the Southern delegates will just simply adjourn. They will bolt from the convention. Northern delegates will also adjourn, but they will come together a couple of weeks later, and they are going to nominate as their candidate Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas will be nominated as their candidate. The Southern delegates will also return. They will meet at a later date, and they are going to select a candidate as well. They are going to select John C. Breckinridge. So what you're going to have in the election of 1860 at this point is two candidates, two Democratic candidates. Northern Democrats are going to support Stephen Douglas, and the Southern Democrats are going to support John C. Breckinridge. The third candidate in the election of 1860 will be John Bell. John Bell will be representing the Constitutional Union Party. And the hope was that the Constitutional Union Party would appeal to all of those people, all of those Americans that were caught in the middle, both literally and physically. In other words, you have a Democratic Party that's split along sectional lines, a northern candidate and a southern candidate. Well, the hope was that the Constitutional Union Party would appeal to those people in the border states, in a Tennessee, a Kentucky. The Constitutional Union Party is hoping for a compromise. They're looking to compromise. They're looking for a way to hold the Union together, because all the ominous signs are there. All the ominous signs are in place that we are moving towards an ultimate conflict. Now, the Republican Party will meet in Chicago in May, and they're quite confident. Party insiders believed that they could count on all but 5 or 6 of the northern states voting for a Republican candidate. What party apparatchiks believed was all of the rest of those states in the north that were in play, what they needed to win Pennsylvania. They needed to win Pennsylvania plus Indiana or Illinois. If this scenario played out and the entire South voted for John C. Breckinridge, the Republican candidate would in fact be elected. One of the front runners for the Republican nomination was William Seward. William Seward of the higher law speech. And William Seward, who talked increasingly of this irrepressible conflict, was viewed as a radical. He was viewed as a radical. And so Horace Greeley, editor and owner of the New York Tribune, will be working behind the scenes to get Seward dumped for a candidate that would be far more appealing, especially to those states that were still in play. The man that emerges will be Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, who was firmly against slavery. He had political experience. He had held office. He'd been in Congress. He'd served in the Senate. He had been a Whig. He had a pretty good reputation. The fact of the matter is that Lincoln had the reputation as being honest Abe. Honest Abe, the rail splitter. And so here is Abe Lincoln, who is seen and will be portrayed as being very close to the common man. He'll be able to appeal to the common individual, which this harkens back to Andrew Jackson. And this image is very important in American politics. And you can make the argument that in many cases it still is. This image. So during the campaign season, we'll have two campaigns occurring simultaneously for the office of the presidency. In the North, you will have the Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln, who represents a party that has taken a firm stand against the expansion of slavery. Okay? Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln versus Stephen Douglas of the Democratic Party. In the South, there will be another campaign occurring, and it will be John Bell versus John C. Breckinridge. I mean, the GOP is not even going to bother. The Republican Party is not even going to bother putting up a ticket in the South because they knew that it was useless. They knew that Lincoln would not receive votes in the South. So, as November of 1860 approaches, as Election Day approaches, there will be a climate of hysteria that will begin to grip the nation as Southerners begin to recognize that Lincoln is in the catbird seat, that Lincoln is in fact going to win this election. One Southerner proclaimed, "The South will never submit to such humiliation and degradation as the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln." What humiliation, you might ask? Well, the South viewed the possible election of Lincoln, the election of a Republican to the office of the presidency as a humiliation. I mean, this is a guy that opposed slavery, opposed the expansion of slavery. And he represented someone that threatened their very way of life. There was also the belief that the election of Lincoln represented someone who violated these constitutional sets of ideals whereby the federal government would not interfere. Now, as the hysteria envelopes the nation, many Republicans took it all with a grain of salt. They looked back on American history and could cite a number of examples where the South had threatened to separate or secede from the Union. And many Republicans just said, it's just a threat. They've been doing this for years. They've been engaging in inflammatory rhetoric. What many Republican insiders believe was simply that if Lincoln was elected, what many Southerners say in Congress would do is simply walk out, have a couple of drinks, and then return to their posts. But as we all know, this won't be the case. The Democratic Party will engage in a very, very ugly campaign. The campaign that the Republicans will wage will be an attempt to tap into the racial fears. And this is going to be, without a doubt, one of the more racist campaigns in American political history. There are a number of cartoons that the Democratic Party will use in northern states. And I just have one here to show you. The one that I'd like to show you, I have not been able to locate it, but it shows a black man and a white woman engaging in a French kiss. And Lincoln and William Seward are in the background looking on benevolently. So this race baiting will be used by the Democratic Party, and it will be used in the northern states, especially those states that were still in play. hoping to tap into those racial fears that existed. The Republican Abraham Lincoln manages to win all of the free states with the exception of Jersey. In the state of New Jersey, he will split with Stephen Douglas. Lincoln will win 39% of the popular vote. Even if his opponents had been able to combine their vote tally, they would not have been able to overcome Abraham Lincoln in the Electoral College. So in other words, if we would have combined Douglas, Bell, and Breckinridge together, they did not have enough electoral votes to defeat the Republican Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln becomes president-elect of the United States. Frederick Douglass rejoices. While he doesn't see Lincoln as being radical enough on the issue of slavery, nonetheless he writes that Lincoln represents a clear break, clearly represents a termination of the power of the South. And Douglass believed that Lincoln was going to be able to take steps to elevate the office of the presidency, if not to being an abolitionist, but to being opposed to the extension or the expansion or the growth of the institution of slavery. Historian Charles Francis Adams, viewing the situation at the time, wrote, "With the election of Lincoln, the great revolution has taken place. The country has once and for all thrown off the domination of slaveholders." Clearly, with the election of Lincoln, the T had been thrown overboard. Enjoy life. Good day.